the most audacious takeover in human history. Picture this: a small island nation, barely the size of Oregon, cold, grey, perpetually rainy. And yet, at its peak, this tiny island controlled 25% of all land on Earth. 1 in 4 human beings alive answered to its king. Its navy patrolled every ocean simultaneously. Its language became the global default. Its laws shaped constitutions that exist to this day. We're talking about Britain. Not Rome, not Mongolia, not America, Britain. So how did a rainy island of 30 million people come to dominate a planet of 1.6 billion? Hey there, curious thinkers. That's what we're answering today. The sea was their superpower. Every empire needs an unfair advantage. For Britain, it was water. Britain is an island. That single geographic fact shaped everything. No land borders meant no land invasions, while every European rival spent centuries fighting wars on their doorstep. Britain sat safely behind the English Channel, building ships instead of walls. And ships meant trade, and trade meant money, and money meant more ships. By the 1600s, Britain had developed the most sophisticated naval technology on Earth. Not just warships, merchant vessels, supply ships, navigation instruments. They didn't just sail the oceans, they mastered them. The British Navy became the world's greatest force multiplier. One warship could project power across thousands of miles of ocean, threatening coastlines, blockading ports, protecting trade routes, all without a single soldier setting foot on foreign soil. Geography gave Britain the island. Britain turned the island into an empire. The East India Company, history's most dangerous corporation. Britain didn't conquer the world with its army. It conquered the world with a corporation. The East India Company, founded in 1600, was unlike anything that had ever existed. It had its own army, its own navy, its own courts, its own foreign policy. It could declare war, sign treaties, mint coins, and govern territories, all in the name of profit. At its peak, the East India Company's private army was twice the size of the British Army itself. It started simply enough, trading spices, silk, and cotton from India. But trade has a way of becoming control. When local rulers resisted, the company fought them. When they won, and they usually won because their soldiers had better weapons, better discipline, and better tactics, they didn't leave. They stayed. They taxed, they extracted. India alone, the jewel in the crown, was systematically drained. Economists estimate Britain extracted the equivalent of $45 trillion from India over 200 years. Textile industries that had supplied the world for centuries were deliberately destroyed to protect British manufacturers. Famines that killed millions were allowed to happen, sometimes accelerated, because grain was being exported for profit while people starved. This wasn't accidental. It was a business model. And it worked so well that Britain applied it everywhere: Africa, Australia, Canada, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, the Middle East. The East India Company was eventually dissolved after the Indian Rebellion of 1857. But by then, the British government simply took over what the company had built. The empire didn't end, it just changed management. How they held it all together. Controlling 25% of the world requires more than a corporation. It requires force, or the credible threat of it. Britain's military dominance rested on 3 pillars. First, naval supremacy. After the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, Britain had no serious naval rival for over a century. The Royal Navy didn't just protect British interests, it defined the rules of global trade. If you wanted to ship goods across oceans, you operated on Britain's terms. Second, technological advantage. The Industrial Revolution happened in Britain first. That meant British soldiers had rifles when their opponents had muskets, steam-powered gunboats when their enemies had wooden sailing ships, the telegraph for instant communication when their rivals relied on messengers on horseback. Every decade, the gap widened. Third, and most underrated, local soldiers. Britain was brilliant at recruiting soldiers from the territories it conquered to help conquer more territories. Indian soldiers fought for Britain in Africa. African soldiers fought in Asia. The empire was, in a very real sense, self-funding and self-reinforcing. Conquered people became the instrument of further conquest. The most powerful weapon was an idea. But raw force alone cannot hold an empire together. Not one this size. Not for this long. Britain's most powerful weapon wasn't the rifle or the gunboat. It was the idea that British civilization was superior. British schools replaced local languages with English. British courts replaced local traditions. British history books erased local histories. Children across India, Africa, and the Caribbean grew up believing their own cultures were primitive and that the empire was doing them a favor. You don't need as many soldiers when the occupied population has been convinced that occupation is civilization. And it outlasted the empire itself. English is now the global language of business and science. Common law governs dozens of independent nations. The borders Britain drew across Africa and the Middle East still exist, still causing conflicts that were essentially designed into them. Britain didn't just occupy land, it rewired the world. Why it fell? So if it was so effective, why did it end? 3 reasons. First, cost. 2 world wars bled Britain dry. The country that had funded global empire for centuries emerged from 1945 essentially bankrupt, dependent on American loans to survive. Empire became too expensive to maintain. Second, resistance. Colonized people never stopped fighting back. From the Indian independence movement to uprisings across Africa and the Caribbean, the cost of suppression kept rising. Gandhi understood something profound, that Britain's empire depended on cooperation, and cooperation could be withdrawn. Third, the idea collapsed. After the Holocaust, the world had seen where racial superiority arguments led. The moral foundation of empire, that some people were civilized enough to rule others, became impossible to defend publicly. The ideology that had justified 300 years of conquest crumbled in a decade. Between 1945 and 1975, Britain granted independence to dozens of colonies. Not always gracefully, not always completely, but the empire was over. Closing. Britain controlled 25% of the world because of geography, corporations, technology, military force, and the most powerful weapon of all, an idea implanted into the minds of the conquered. It lasted 300 years. It ended in 30. And its fingerprints are everywhere, in the languages we speak, the borders on our maps, the laws in our courts, the conflicts still burning in places Britain carved up and walked away from. The British Empire didn't just conquer territory, it shaped the modern world, for better and for worse. Empires fall, but the systems they create don't disappear. They evolve. And in many ways, we're still living inside the one Britain built. If you enjoy deep dives into history, subscribe to Why Stories for Curious Thinkers.